The channel MythVision recently posted a video arguing that the Bible's idea of an afterlife with punishments and rewards actually came from Zoroastrianism. The biblical authors took these ideas from Zoroastrianism during the Persian period and added them to the Bible's theology. But not all scholars would agree with this, and I'm going to tell you why. But first, let me play the clip where Derek makes his case. Now, many scholars would agree with what Derek is about to say in his video, and Derek definitely deserves credit for his research, but I think he's missing some important pieces of data when making his arguments. Let's take a listen.
When we turn to early Israelite religion, we find an afterlife concept remarkably similar to Mesopotamian Ker. The Hebrew scriptures describe a realm called Sheol, often translated as the grave or the pit, as the destination of all the dead, both righteous and wicked. Sheol is described in the Hebrew Bible as a place of darkness, silence, and forgetfulness. The psalmist laments, "For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give you praise?" And elsewhere, the dead do not praise the Lord, nor do any who go down into silence. These texts suggest that early Israelite belief envisioned no post-mortem reward or punishment, no heaven or hell, as later understood. The reward for righteousness was a prosperous life and honorable burial. The punishment for wickedness was an early death or disaster in this life. But after death, all souls shared the same fate in the silence of Sheol. This is a very critical point for our investigation. The original Hebrew religion contained no concept of hell as a place of fiery torment for sinners. As scholar John D. Levinson of Harvard University notes, the Hebrew Bible does not present a systematic doctrine of the afterlife. The dominant view seems to be that all go down to Sheol, described as a place of darkness, silence, and even non-being, regardless of their moral character. The absence of hell from early Israelite texts challenges the notion that eternal punishment was part of God's original revelation to humanity. If divine judgment in an afterlife was a fundamental truth, we would expect it to be clearly articulated from the beginning of biblical revelation. Instead, we find it emerging gradually.
Actually, most theologians do not expect to find the core doctrines of Christianity or even Judaism in the earliest biblical texts. There are many important doctrines that are not found in the oldest texts, but this isn't a problem for theologians because most of them accept the idea of progressive revelation. Progressive revelation is the idea that God reveals truth progressively over time. Progressive revelation is actually common sense because if all the important teachings of Judaism and Christianity were given in the earliest texts in the Bible, then there would be no need for the later texts. The fact that the Bible is comprised of documents spanning several centuries implies that more doctrinal truth is given over time. Just because the earliest parts of the Bible do not have a clear teaching regarding the resurrection or the afterlife, this should not be concerning for Christians.
So if hell was not part of the original Israelite religion, where did it come from? To answer this question, we must look east, to the Persian Empire and its revolutionary religious ideas. When Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem in 586 BCE, many Israelites were forcibly relocated to Babylon. Later, when the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, the Jews came under Persian rule. This period of exile proved transformative for Jewish religious thought. The exiles encountered new religious ideas, particularly those of Zoroastrianism, the dominant religion of Persia. And it was here that concepts resembling heaven and hell first entered the Judaic worldview. Zoroastrianism, founded by the prophet Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, around 1000 to 600 BCE, taught a stark dualism, a cosmic battle between Ahura Mazda, the wise lord of goodness, and Manu, called Ahriman, the spirit of evil. In this worldview, the entire cosmos was divided between the forces of truth and falsehood, light and darkness. Crucially, this battle extended into the afterlife. According to Zoroastrian sacred text, upon death, each soul must cross the Chinvat bridge, the bridge of judgment, which spans the chasm between the living world and the spiritual realms. On this bridge, one's deeds are weighed. For the righteous, the bridge widens and they pass safely into the house of song, paradise. For the wicked, however, the bridge narrows to a razor edge and they plunge into the abyss of Drudge, Demana, the house of lies. effectively the Zoroastrian hell. This was a place of punishment and misery, ruled by the forces of evil, described as a realm of darkness, cold and stench. The soul would remain there, suffering until the end of time, when good would ultimately triumph and the cosmos would be renewed. Here, for perhaps the first time in religious history, we see a fully developed concept of cosmic moral dualism extending into the afterlife, eternal bliss for the righteous, prolonged torture for the wicked. This was revolutionary. Unlike in Mesopotamia or early Hebrew thought, in Zoroastrianism, morality absolutely determined one's fate after death. Scholars widely believe that Persian ideas profoundly influenced Second Temple Judaism after the Babylonian exile. As one researcher notes, before the exile and Persian contact, Jews believed that the souls of the dead went to a dull Hades-like place called Sheol. After the exile, the idea of a moralized afterlife with heavenly rewards for the good and hellish punishment for the evil appear in Judaism. The evidence for this influence is compelling. Before the exile, the Hebrew Bible contains no clear reference to rewards in heaven or torments in hell. The dead simply go to Sheol, silent pit. But after living under Persian rule, Jewish writings began to reflect a moralized afterlife. For example, the book of Daniel, written around 165 BCE, long after the Persian period, suddenly prophesies, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." This represents a striking departure from earlier theology and mirrors Persian ideas of separate fates for good and evil. Even the language betrays Persian influence. The very word paradise, for heaven, is derived from the Persian term paradisa or paradisa, meaning the walled garden.
Derek says Daniel 12:2 represents a striking departure from earlier Jewish theology and mirrors Persian ideas of separate fates for good and evil. But is this actually true? Actually, it doesn't match Zoroastrianism very well, and it does fit much better with earlier passages in the Bible. Stephen L. Cook writes, "It is erroneous, for example, to consider Daniel 12:1-3 and its vision of resurrection as discontinuous with preceding biblical tradition and a likely byproduct of Israel's contact with Zoroastrianism. In Daniel 12, the dead awake to the resurrection from their sleep in the dust of the earth. No such sort of resurrection is found in Zoroastrianism, which shuns the burial of corpses as potentially defiling to the earth. The Persians did not imagine the rising of buried corpses, but a recreation of bodies from the bare elements of nature." So if Daniel's concept of an afterlife, beginning with a bodily resurrection, doesn't come from Zoroastrianism, where does it come from? Cook argues that a much more likely source of this idea in Daniel comes from a much older passage, Isaiah 26:19, which says, "Your dead will live, their corpses will rise. You who lie in the dust, awake and shout for joy, for your dew is as the dew of the dawn, and the earth will give birth to the departed spirits." Notice the similarities between this passage and Daniel 12:2. Daniel 12:2 says that those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake. Isaiah 26:19 says, "You who lie in the dust, awake." The verbal parallel is unmistakable. Therefore, not only does Daniel 12 not match Zoroastrianism's idea of the afterlife, but it has an almost identical verbal match with Isaiah. But where did Daniel get his concept of judgment of the wicked, who will rise to disgrace and everlasting contempt? This idea is also probably coming from Isaiah, specifically Isaiah 66:22-24, which describes the new heavens and the new earth with all humankind bowing before the Lord. And then verse 24 says, "Then they will go forth and look on the corpses of the men who have transgressed against me. For their worm will not die and their fire will not be quenched, and they will be held in contempt by all humankind." Daniel uses the same Hebrew word for contempt that Trito Isaiah uses to describe the punishment of the wicked in the eschatological judgment. Therefore, Derek is wrong to say that Daniel represents a striking departure from earlier Jewish theology and mirrors Persian ideas of separate fates for good and evil. Actually, on the contrary, Daniel 12 mirrors earlier Jewish texts and heavily contradicts Persian ideas of the afterlife. Now, while it seems more likely that the author of Daniel based his doctrine of the resurrection on passages from Isaiah, could it be possible that these ideas in Isaiah themselves sprang from the Persian influence of Zoroastrianism? Well, Isaiah 26:19 is found in the section of Isaiah scholars call Proto-Isaiah, which was written in the 8th century BCE before Persia conquered the Babylonian Empire. However, Isaiah 26:19 is part of the Isaiah Apocalypse, found in Isaiah 24 through 27, and most critical scholars date this section much later to the post-exilic period when Persian ideas could have had an influence. This means it is possible that the passages in Isaiah describing the resurrection and afterlife could be the result of Persian influence. But there's a problem with this. As mentioned earlier, the way the resurrection is depicted as the corpses rising is completely antithetical to the Persian conception of the afterlife. So was this idea of resurrection and an afterlife already around in Jewish theology before the influence of Persia played a role? Stephen Cook says yes, pointing to the vision of the dry bones. Scholars date Ezekiel to before the Persian period, and therefore Persian ideas would not have influenced this chapter of Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 37, the prophet has a vision in which God shows him a valley of bones, and the bones rise and return to life with flesh growing back over them. This description is not meant to portray the final day of resurrection, but instead is a metaphor for Israel. However, it could still provide evidence for a pre-Persian Jewish belief in resurrection. Stephen Cook explains, Ezekiel 37 uses resurrection as a metaphor, but the implications of this use are momentous. The prophet is assuming that his readers will relate to his metaphor and find it persuasive. He would certainly not have chosen resurrection as the literary vehicle of this message if the idea had been a foreign and unintelligible concept in the mind of his exilic audience. Ezekiel's use of resurrection language is symbolic, to be sure, but it demonstrates how rising from death was far from an anomalous idea in Hebrew tradition. Ezekiel's description of the bones of the dead growing flesh and the dead returning to life matches Isaiah's and Daniel's descriptions much better than the ideas of Zoroastrianism, and this provides support for the belief in an afterlife inaugurated by a bodily resurrection before the time of Persian influence. But this begs the question, if Jews didn't get the idea of resurrection from the Persians, then where did they get it from? Stephen Cook answers this question as well, saying, social scientific insights cast further doubt on the idea that some external influence, such as an influx of Persian religion, must account for the rise of Israelite apocalypticism. Across cultures, apocalyptic beliefs, including beliefs in resurrection, regularly arise autochthonously, meaning without outside influence, out of native religious building blocks. No foreign influences were at play in 1890 CE, for example, when the ghost dance arose among Native Americans with its visions that a Messiah was now on earth and a resurrection of ancestors was imminent. Therefore, we do not need to assume that an outside influence must be responsible for the emergence of a belief in the resurrection or afterlife in Jewish thought. Thanks for watching the video, and if you liked it, make sure to subscribe. The next video I'm coming out with soon will cover 13 medically documented modern-day miracles, and you won't want to miss it. See you then.